relax, and welcome to Myers ASMR. It's always good to see you. If you feel like you don't have a reason to feel better, then wanting to feel better is a reason to feel better. If you feel like you don't have a reason to feel better, wanting to feel better is a reason to feel better. Before I jump into Tatham Mound by science fiction and fantasy writer Piers Anthony, who I adore, I've got to taste a bit of this chocolate carob coffee banana blueberry. What else is in this? Sea moss, muscle milk powder, coconut milk, nutmeg, cinnamon smoothie. It also has 3 dates, flax seeds, chia seeds, a dash of turmeric, about a teaspoon of olive oil, a teaspoon of coconut oil, and honey. Did I say coffee? Yeah, I did say coffee. Oh, and almonds. I put a handful of almonds in there. I do not play. I consider breakfast to be the most nutritious and healthiest meal for me. It sets the tone for me. So that way, I get to get down later on, when it's time for me to film my videos. I know, well, at least I started with something super duper healthy. So I still try to keep it healthy, but at least I feel like I have a great start and a great base. And this tastes fantastic. That's the reason why I put the muscle milk powder in it. Not that I really think, you know what, let me keep it positive. Yeah, honestly, I like the taste of the muscle milk drinks. And I decided to get the powder, which doesn't taste exactly the same as the liquid beverage. But for now, now I just use the powder for sweetness in my smoothies, and it gives a good flavor. Did I say avocado? Yes. I put about 2 big tablespoons of avocado. And the carob, if you're thinking, oh my God, she put banana with blueberry and cocoa powder, trust me, that carob and cocoa powder just dominate the flavor. It kind of doesn't matter. You could put broccoli in there, spinach, and that cocoa and carob will dominate, and it'll just taste like dessert. So for me, this is a great way to get nutrition into my body in a way that's palpable. Nope, nobody's paying me here. I'm not sponsored by the avocado industry. I wish I was, because I would tout the glory all over the world. I wish I was sponsored for this stuff. How you like my hairpiece? get into this great book by Piers Anthony. Tatham Mound. Let me see, where should I put the book? I think I'll put it over here. I'm going to start with the introduction because I think it will give some understanding to the story. This part is not fiction. This is just giving background about how the story came about. In 1983, Brent Wiseman of the University of Florida was searching for Seminole Indian sites relating to the Second Seminole War. One was believed to be in Citrus County near the Sweeping Bend. Wait a minute. I don't know if this is fiction or not. He's such a good writer. It sounds like he's given a background about how the book came to be. Well, let's see. Let's see how things pan out. One was believed to be in Citrus County, near the Sweeping Bend of the Withlacoochee River, called the Cove of the Withlacoochee. He had assistance from a team of volunteers from the Withlacoochee River Archaeology Council. They hoped to locate the secret stronghold of the famed Seminole leader Osceola in the 19th century, when he hid from the white man's troops and conducted the war that the United States was never quite able to win. Instead, to their surprise, they discovered an unnatural hill in the level, swampy area near the river. It was 2 meters, 6 feet high, and 20 meters, 60 feet across, and overgrown with brush and small trees. It looked very much like an earlier Indian burial mound, hidden in the wilderness of the cove. Brent returned with Jeffrey Mitchum, also of UF, and conducted a shovel test. They selected appropriate spots and started digging a square hole. Less than a foot down, they encountered pay dirt, part of a human skull, and some long bone fragments and pottery shards. This was enough to confirm the mound as a safety harbor site. Historically, the safety harbor peoples of the Tampa Bay region are known as the Tocobaga Indians, who were first contacted by Spanish explorers early in the 16th century. Relatively little is known about them because they disappeared before Florida was settled by the Europeans. The mound was on land that had been safeguarded in its natural state by Mr. Tatham. Thus the mound was titled Tatham Mound, and preparations were made for its archaeological excavation by the University of Florida. One might consider such a project to be hardly worthwhile, because available evidence suggested that this region was a relative backwater, even in Indian terms. Certainly little money was available for such things. However, the parents of one of the girls in WRAC got interested and decided to underwrite the excavation of Tatham Mound. Thus, this project became viable at an early date and the work proceeded. There's a question about the excavation of burial mounds that needs to be addressed. The disposition of the dead was a serious business to the Indians, as it is to us of the contemporary world, and for similar reason. We do not bury our lost beloved for the purpose of having some stranger muck about in the grave and play with the remains. If you believe, as many in both cultures do, that there is a spiritual association with the physical body, the desecration of those remains assumes a greater significance. Have we of one culture the right to interfere with what those of another culture set up? Shouldn't we honor their beliefs and practice as we wish others to honor ours? In short, shouldn't that mound have been left alone? On the other hand, our approach to the mound is not one of disrespect. Little is known of the Indians of southeastern America and almost nothing of those of central Florida, and less yet of the Tocobaga. Their heritage was in danger of being entirely lost unless it could be recovered through research and field work. This mound represented perhaps the last significant opportunity to learn about these Indians, and if it was not excavated, their culture could indeed be lost. If the burial of the dead is intended to maintain the memory of the lives and culture of the tribe, this memory can better be facilitated by study of those burials. In fact, in this age of literacy and of computer technology, the museum may be a better repository for those bones than the ground. I remember when I was young reading James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans and being struck by the horror of an entire tribe dying out. I lived at the time in Vermont, where the Mohicans or Mahicans once were, and was deeply moved by that notion, though the novel itself may have been unrealistic adventure. Now I live in Citrus County, Florida, and this mound showed that there were Indians here too. To me, it would seem a crime to let their memory perish. Perhaps these views balance out the sanctity of the original mound versus the preservation of the knowledge of the culture. But there is a practical factor. Once a mound is discovered, it will not be left alone. It will be looted by unscrupulous scavengers who will sell the beads and other native artifacts, put the pottery on mantles, and carelessly scatter the bones. No respect for law stops these lawless. They simply come and take what they can find. After they have passed, what remains has diminished value as either sacred burial or for research. Also, many mounds have been bulldozed flat by developers or farmers clearing their fields for planting. That was why Tatham Mound might be the last chance of the many other safety harbor mounds known in the state. Only this one remained intact and unlooted. Those of us who care for either Indian heritage or the sanctity of the dead may be outraged, but it was a fact. The mound would not be left alone. Therefore, there was only one answer. It had to be excavated now, carefully, under competent supervision, so that its record of this tribe and therefore of the Indians of this section of the country could be salvaged. Perhaps ideally it would have been better to leave it alone, untouched, but that was not a viable choice. What was found in the mound? Several hundred burials, perhaps the largest collection of early 16th century Spanish artifacts associated with the North American Indians, and convincing evidence that these natives had had contact with the explorer Hernando de Soto. The face of local archaeology was significantly changed. Much more is now known about these obscure Florida Indians than was available before. There is a longer discussion of such matters in the author's note at the end of this book. But what of the people buried there? These folks lived and died, and their demise, as shown by the evidence of the mound, was tragic. What was their personal story, we can never know precisely, but this novel represents one conjecture. This is a vision of the living folk of the region whose bones were found in Tatham Mound. It could have happened this way. We do not know the language of the Tocobaga Indians, but assume it was affiliated with the large Timucuan group to its immediate north. For convenience, the language employed to tell this story is modern, with place names usually rendered as their meanings. Thus, for example, The Withlacoochee River is the Little Big River. Where the Indian concepts do not align perfectly with ours, approximations or vernacular terms are used, though this may seem anachronistic. The point is that these were living, feeling human beings whose vanished culture is worthy of respect as is our own. We honor them to the best of our ability by coming to know and understand them, and by living for the time of this novel in their world. Let them not be completely unknown or forgotten. Chapter 1 of Tatham Mound is called Spirit. I am the tale teller. I am dying, but before I join the realm of the spirits, I must tell my final tales, that those I love who are buried here may be properly introduced. O Spirit of the Mound, I begin with you, for it was you who warned me, you who would have saved us had I been able to honor your stricture. You were right. You spoke truly, and now the grief you prophesied has come to pass. I always believed you. It was only my failing as a man, my grievous misunderstanding, that prevented me from doing what you urged. How great is my grief for that failure, for now those I love are dead, when they should have lived. I beg you to welcome their spirits, for they are blameless. Only I am guilty, and only my bones will not join yours, and only my spirit will be lost. The wild animals will drag my body away and defile it. In this way I will pay for my failure as I deserve. But the others are worthy, O Spirit, and they should be fit company for you, though they died too soon. I count on my hands, my fingers, the winters since we met. It was 10, and 10 more, and 10 more, and 5 more. I was a stripling of 10 and 5 winters in quest of my manhood. I still used my childhood name, for I had not yet earned a worthy title. How long ago that seems! How far away, though time is as nothing to the spirit realm, and this is the very place it happened. It is as though it was a different person, that innocent youth. I am embarrassed for him, for his naivete, his innocence, and his ignorance. I must speak of him as if he were another person. But you will know the truth, O Spirit of the Mound. You will know it as you have always known it. I must tell it and make known the tragedy his era allowed, for my words are all I have remaining to give. Then my onus will be abated, and you will remember me, though my spirit is gone. You will know the good people I have known and loved, not only here but elsewhere. I do not ask your forgiveness, only that you listen. O Spirit, here is how it started, when Hotfoot came to meet you. They had laughed when the child ventured onto the sun-heated sand to dance madly as his bare feet burned, and ran mincingly back to his mother, crying. Hotfoot, they called him, and that became his youth name. Hotfoot, who had not heeded his mother's warning and had strayed too far. It was derisive, yet also apt, for he grew to be swift on his feet, and to wander far, and to get into much trouble, even as he had started. When he was 15 winters old, he was the fastest runner of the village. No one could catch him. not even grown warriors, when they held contests amongst the clans. It was the Eagle clan who won because of hot foot. He could maintain it too, for he liked to run. And the more he did it, the farther he was able to go without tiring. He became a messenger between villages as far as a day distant, for he could reach them and return in the time it took another to walk there. Sometimes he was several days away and had contact with tribes that spoke other tongues. He had proved as swift with language as with his feet, and had learned the tongues of the Kale to the north and the Calusa to the south, not perfectly, but well enough to get by, with the help of sign language and pictographs in the sand. But he was not yet a man, and that was an increasingly grievous fault. He was not entitled to wear body paint or to speak at a ceremony. He wore his hair loose, in the manner of a woman, not permitted to tie it back, in the manner of a man. He could not marry, or indeed have a woman for sex, because none would touch a boy. With manhood, several would be available. They had ways of letting him know, but mostly it was pride. He needed the status of a man. That was why he teamed up with Woodpecker and Alligator to make their first genuine war party raid. They had, of course, indulged in many mock raids. Virtually the whole of a male's youth consisted of just such games. First, they had learned to hunt the simplest creatures, bringing down squirrels with their small arrows, and worked their way over the years up to deer. Then they had approached the most difficult prey, man. They matched clan against clan and threatened each other fiercely, but never seriously, for the clans were all parts of the great tribe of the Toko. They believed they were ready, and they were certainly eager. They had gone to Chief Slaybear for permission, and it had been granted. For this, the clans united, and the respect they had learned for each other in the mock contest could be acknowledged in this real one. For courtesy and the sharing of a taste of adult honor, they referred to each other by their clan names, thus Woodpecker, rather than the child name that would soon be lost, and Alligator and Eagle rather than Hotfoot. This gave them each a sense of importance and responsibility, for it was not merely themselves they represented, but the honor of their clans. The youths of the other clans, the rattlesnake, tortoise, deer, bear, and panther, would be envious of the honor these three won this day. Hotfoot's father was a rattlesnake, but he would not begrudge the Eagle clan this day, though in any tribal function he would support his own. A person's clan was determined by that of the mother, and no one could marry into his own clan, for all were brothers and sisters in name. Thus every father had to watch the success of his son without applause, but with secret pride. Now they were crossing the Little Big River in their canoe to Kale territory. It would have been extremely bad form to raid an affiliated village, but the river was the cultural and political boundary between tribes. The Kale were suitable enemies. They spoke a different tongue, used different pottery, and made similar raids into Toko territory. Therefore, it was only fitting that prior grievances be redressed. He was not on business now as a messenger, so had no protection from assault, and no need to honor any truce. They had prepared with suitable ceremony, performing the preparation dance, enduring an overnight vigil, drinking and vomiting the white drink to purify themselves, fasting, and accepting the painful ritual scratching on their forearms and calves without flinching. But that was merely the preparation. Manhood came only with verified heroism in war. They would serve as witnesses for each other and were bound to tell the truth. To do otherwise was to risk correction by the spirits and bring shame, not only on them, but on their families, for rearing them, and on their clans, and on their village, and on their tribe. To deceive an enemy was a great feat, but to deceive a friend was evil. Now they were dressed in their loin cloths, with leggings to enable them to get through the thorny brush, and armed with bows, arrows, and knives. Spears were too long and clumsy to carry on a secret raid. If they could not strike at arrow distance or defend themselves with their knives, then they were not fit to be warriors. They had made their bows themselves, finding the best saplings, molding them in the hot ashes of a fire, carving them carefully, and stringing them with deer tendons, and had cut their own arrows similarly. They had good knives, their stone blades chipped from the quarry to the west and bound to secure wood handles. But Hotfoot hoped he would not have to use his knife, because that would mean he was within reach of an enemy warrior's knife, and he could be stabbed and die even if he managed to kill the man. He hoped that this thought did not make him a coward. The priest had told them that fear was natural, but that a warrior did not yield to it. So now his fear was not so much of getting hurt or killed, but of yielding to fear itself and disqualifying himself as a warrior. Humiliation was worse than death. As a child he had doubted, but now he knew. Hotfoot had the lead paddle, and Alligator the rear. Both stroked swiftly and silently as Woodpecker knelt in the center, bow ready, watching for enemies. If they were careless, they might be attacked before they had a chance to strike, or the enemy might wait and steal their dugout canoe, so that when they returned, they would be stranded. Either would be disaster. Their objective was to come upon the enemy unobserved, strike, and escape unscathed, leaving behind only the toko arrows they used. Those arrows would make clear what tribe had inflicted the devastation on the Kale, completing the honor for the raiders and the dishonor for the victims. Hotfoot had been nervous during the vigil and probably would not have been hungry even if he were not fasting. So many things could go wrong. But as he started out on the mission, he felt only excitement. Now his mood was level and grim. He intended to accomplish his heroism no matter what the cost, and be a man at last. He knew his companions felt the same. They had justification, of course. The Kale had severely wounded an elder tribesman of a Taffy half a moon before, and gotten away cleanly. Retribution was required, and 3 of them had volunteered to achieve it. To their surprise, this mission had been granted. Perhaps it was because most of the men were currently hunting deer to get a supply of flesh for drying and smoking. More likely it was because the elders judged it was time for these boys to become men. The crossing was uneventful. No enemy spied them. Hotfoot had not entirely trusted Woodpecker's alertness. He had peered closely at the riverbank, between paddle strokes, verifying it. He had glanced into the dawn sky, too, to make sure no bird of prey passed over them. That would have been a sure signal of mischief, unless it was an eagle, but all was well. They coasted into their landing at a spot hidden by overhanging palmetto. They stepped out singly and drew the canoe up, hiding it under old palmetto fronds. It was important that it be both invisible to outsiders and ready for instant launching, for the pursuit could be close on their return. Now they set out on foot toward the nearest Kale village. They knew its location because it was on the trade route, as was their own town of Atafi. They were not following the trade path now, for that would have invited discovery. Instead, they cut through the oak hammocks, stepping carefully so as to leave little or no trace. But the hammocks were like islands in the swampy region, and they had to venture through marsh and even some standing water. This was nervous business because of the poisonous water snakes, but they moved slowly, made it through, and stepped out without leaving footprints. Then higher ground and a deer trail, so progress was easier. But they did not approach the village closely. Instead, they circled around it. It would be foolish to raid the closest one. Pursuit would be too certain and swift. They had to raid a more distant one that did not anticipate this, and whose inhabitants would at first be confused. By the time the Kale oriented, the raiders could be far away and perhaps would never be tracked. To get away cleanly, that was the ideal. They scouted their route more carefully as they drew closer to their objective. Haste was not necessary. They took the time required to spy out the best unobvious trail, so that they would know it and use it without hesitation on the return while the pursuers floundered. The ideal was a network of trails with divides and dead ends that would cause the pursuers to get lost following them. Since this was enemy territory, they had to use what existed, what could change from one trail to another according to a pattern they decided on. That way, they could move rapidly on trails instead of slowly through brush and brambles, while the pursuers could not do the same for fear of losing trace of them. The thoroughness with which they prepared for their escape was critical because they were on man's business now. All that they had rehearsed in play all their lives was about to be put to the proof. Any mistake could forever deny them the manhood they sought, because those who were caught raiding were enslaved or killed. The same was true for the Kale raiders caught by the Toko. There was one other complication. It was now late afternoon. They would have to make their raid and escape by night. That would help them hide, but would also make it easier for them to lose their way. This would be a test of their ability to retrace their set route in changed circumstances. Now Hotfoot got nervous again. They had undertaken the mission, and they had reached the vicinity of the village. What now? They could not simply charge in and start clubbing enemy warriors. They would be overwhelmed in short order. "We'll ambush the first warrior to use this path," Woodpecker said as they spied a heavily traveled trail. "Then we'll kill any who pursue." Woodpecker was the nominal leader of this party, being 16 winters old. If any of them did not get home, it would be his responsibility. He had made his decision. Now they would discover whether it was good. Almost immediately someone came. They drew on their bows, but it was only a child, a naked little girl running toward the village with her hair flying back. She was not fair game, and they let her pass. She never knew they were there, for they were well concealed. Then a warrior came, a grizzled veteran, leading his old woman. Woodpecker was entitled to the first shot. He loosed his arrow, and it flew true. It caught the man in the left shoulder. The warrior grunted and staggered. The woman screamed. But the man was only wounded. The shot had not killed him. But that meant that alligator had the next turn. He fired, but the warrior was twisting forward and down in his agony, and the arrow missed. Meanwhile, there were answering shouts. The woman's scream had alerted the people of the village. In a moment, the warriors would be here. The three boys knew what to do. They fled. They had drawn blood, and that was the most they could hope for. Now they had to get away before their own blood was spilled. They ducked down and followed their escape route, which was the one they had scouted on their way in. In their games of youth, they had learned to remember the details of landscape and vegetation well, so that it was natural to retrace any trail, and Woodpecker was especially good at this. Behind them, the cry intensified. There were whoops as the Kale warriors arrived on the scene and recognized the arrows. At first, the three of them gained exactly as planned. The confusion of the Kale worked to their advantage. With the favor of the spirits, they would get so far ahead that the pursuit would never get close. They lacked that favor. Kale warriors were spreading swiftly out, cutting off their escape. Hotfoot could hear them. They were not bothering to be quiet. They were forming a line that crossed the marked route. There seemed to be three choices: duck down and hide, hoping the Kale would not spy them before dark; proceed forward, hoping to slip past the line of enemies; or make a mad charge for it before the line was tight. All three were dangerous, because the Kale were now aroused and alert and had a fair notion where the fugitives lurked. Woodpecker elected to try the first. This was not cowardice, but a sensible appraisal of their chances. It would be their victory if they escaped undetected. If they were found, they could still make their break for home. He ducked below palmetto fronds, disappearing into the thicket. The others followed. In a moment, they were lying together, absolutely quiet, while the Kale closed in. Soon, a warrior came close, peering this way and that. There seemed to be little chance that he would overlook their hiding place. Indeed, the moment he spied the palmetto clump, he strode directly toward it, his war club ready. It was Hotfoot's turn. He had his bow ready, held horizontally at ground level. The arrow knocked. It was a technique he had practiced. He could shoot an arrow accurately from this position. The point quivered, and Hotfoot realized how nervous he was. He didn't want to do this, but he had to. Slowly, he drew back the string, lifting the point. If the warrior turned aside and passed beyond him, then there would be an excellent excuse not to shoot. It was better to escape detection than to start the commotion all over. The warrior did not pass. He poked at the fronds with his club, his head moving so that he could see beyond them. No chance now to escape unnoticed. Hotfoot lifted the point and loosed his arrow at point-blank range. It happened before he realized it was going to. It was as if his arms and hands belonged to someone else, someone with twice the nerve he never could have. The arrow passed through the warrior's neck. The man did not cry out. He could not, for it was his voice the arrow had transfixed. He simply collapsed, looking surprised. "I never saw a neater kill." Woodpecker breathed, awed. No sound at all. He was speaking of animal kills, of course. None of them had seen a warrior die in battle before. Hotfoot did not answer. He was stunned. He had killed squirrels and rabbits and was reckoned to have a good arm for the bow, but this was a man. He had known this was no game excursion they were on, but still had not until this moment appreciated the full seriousness of it. "Take his scalp," Alligator said. Hotfoot just stared at the dead man, making no move. The death of a man. "We must run," Woodpecker whispered. "They'll find him soon. No time for the scalp." They moved out silently into the closing dusk, but Hotfoot was in a kind of trance, seeing Only that warrior, the arrow through his neck, his eyes widening as he sank down. There was no glory in this kill, only horror. How could he have done it? Why couldn't he have missed as Alligator had, or hit the shoulder as Woodpecker had? Because the man would have cried out and attacked them, and then they would have had to try to kill him more messily. And if they had succeeded by that time, the other Kale would have been there, and that would have been all. He had had to do it. He knew that. Yet still, he was appalled. In this numbed time of flight and thought, Hotfoot knew that he was no warrior. Woodpecker had covered for him, giving him a pretext not to take the scalp, though of course he should have. None of them had experience in cutting heads. They would have bungled it, and indeed they had no time. But it was more than that. Hotfoot knew with absolute certainty that he never wanted to kill again. That was why he was no warrior. They gained distance because the Kale did not at first discover the death of their warrior. They assumed that no outcry meant no discovery, so the rest were still searching their own sections of the closing net. That was good fortune for the raiders, for every moment they passed now made escape more likely. It was almost impossible to track fugitives in darkness, if the fugitives had any skill at all in silent travel. Now they heard the outcry behind as the Kale discovered the slain warrior. But the night was near, and as long as they kept quiet, they were safe. The problem was that the same factors that inhibited the pursuit also inhibited the three of them. They could no longer see the signs they had left or judge the lay of the land they had noted. What had been reasonably familiar was now unfamiliar. Also, the creatures of the night were emerging, including mosquitoes. The biting black flies of day could be squeezed off when they alighted. They tended to come in swarms and lost interest when motion stopped. But mosquitoes were inexorable and invisible in the dark. The three of them had put on no fish oil to repel these because its odor would give away their location. Unfortunately, the bloodsuckers had no trouble locating them. They kept moving regardless. Their progress became noisier as they made missteps, and they blundered into brush and muck, surely leaving a trail that would be obvious by daylight. But they knew that the pursuers would make similar noise unless they used familiar paths. "Let's use the paths," Hotfoot urged. "We can move faster and quieter, and that is less risk than this." "But they'll be watching the paths," Woodpecker protested. "Not if they're searching for us in the brush. They won't expect us on the paths." Woodpecker considered a moment, then agreed. They cut across to the nearest established path, paused to listen for pursuit, then got on it. They were alone. Either the Kale had given up the pursuit or they were not in this vicinity. This helped greatly. They proceeded at almost daytime velocity, for there was no danger of going astray here. In fact, they were now traveling faster than they had by day, for they were no longer establishing an escape route. They reached the river. Now they had to cut through the brush again, for their canoe was hidden well away from the regular path. This slowed them down, for the thickest of the vegetation was near the river. There were brambles and dense thickets, and the ground was marshy. They feared for snakes and alligators, but they were getting close to their canoe, and once they recovered that, they would have an easy time getting the rest of the way back to Atafi. But they couldn't find it in the dark. They ranged back and forth along the slushy bank, searching for the particular palmetto thicket that they had used, but they had hidden the canoe too well. In the night, they were baffled. Finally, they consulted and decided to wait for dawn, when they should be able to spot it readily. They took turns sitting guard, one always alert while two slept. Now Hotfoot became thoroughly aware of the incidental injuries he had taken. The scratches that were not of the ritual preparation, the insect bites, the bruises from stumbling in the darkness. He was also hungry, for he had not eaten in a day and 2 nights, and tired, for he had not rested in that time either. The excitement that had sustained him on the mission was now exhausted. He was not sleepy, just phenomenally weary. But the worst thing was the image of the slain warrior, the arrow through his neck. That man's spirit was surely orienting on Hotfoot now, seeking retribution. The living men could be avoided if one was clever enough, but not the spirits of the dead. The spirits could only be diverted by the intercession of a priest. But until Hotfoot got home, the priest could not intercede. He was vulnerable now. The horror of his action rose like a dark mass before him, seeming to take animate form, and he was afraid. Afraid because of his coming shame, because he was no true warrior, having no joy of killing. Too late, he had learned that he was a coward. But the spirit did not attack immediately, at least not tangibly. That was not the way of spirits, though. They did not make physical mischief. They acted more subtly. They seeped into the body of the offender, entering through his nostrils, his mouth, his anus, and spreading out within, taking time to choose their targets. Often it was the joints, which slowly coalesced so that they operated only with decreasing range and increasing pain, making a cripple of a man without leaving a mark on him. Sometimes it was more subtle yet, so that he sickened and died, and no priest could cure him. One could never be sure that a malignant spirit had not intruded. One had to be always on guard against it, and free of pollution. Hotfoot knew that he was not free. He was now an easy target for the spirit's wrath. Dawn came, and he gazed about, for his watch had been last. Now the locale became increasingly familiar. They were not far at all from the place they sought. Had the night not changed things so much, they should readily have found their canoe. The others stirred. Silently, Hotfoot indicated the direction, and they nodded. They moved to it, and it was there exactly as they had left it. Their hiding place had been secure, almost too secure. Next time, they would be sure to memorize the position in such a way that they could find it by night as well as by day. They launched the canoe and climbed carefully into it. Alligator took the rear paddle this time, and Hotfoot the lead, while Woodpecker knelt in the center as before. They would trade off at intervals, for now they were tired and would be traveling upstream. They glided into the center and beyond, seeking the familiar channel that lacked the main current. The Little Big River was gentle, easy to ride, but still it was pointless to oppose the current unnecessarily. The river narrowed, and disaster struck. Abruptly, a canoe shot out from the bank ahead to intercept them. It carried 6 Kale warriors. The Kale had been watching the river, as the 3 of them should have anticipated. Immediately, Hotfoot and Alligator spun the canoe about, heading downstream, stroking with suddenly renewed strength, but the Kale craft followed, and it had 4 paddlers. It was overhauling them rapidly. Sure, Woodpecker snapped. Indeed, they were already turning to get to it. It was their only chance to escape. They cut close to the dense foliage of the bank, heedless of whatever landing they might make. On land, they would have a chance to hide, to lose themselves in the thickets. This was Togo territory. The war party would not dare remain long for fear of discovery by Togo warriors. The canoe crashed into an overhanging oak branch, and Hotfoot felt a stunning blow to his left shoulder. His left arm went numb, and his left hand lost its hold on the paddle. It didn't matter. He had to scramble out of the canoe as it halted and splashed to the shore behind the other two. Alligator and Woodpecker were fighting their way to land as the enemy canoe came close. An arrow whistled past Hotfoot's head to graze Woodpecker's thigh. Woodpecker seemed not to notice it as he scrambled through the brush. Then they were all through, and a screening of foliage protected their rear for the moment. The Kale would not shoot blindly. Arrows were too precious to waste. Alligator turned to speak to the others and paused, staring at Hotfoot's shoulder. Hotfoot looked and was amazed. An arrow was projecting from his shoulder. The head was deep in the flesh, the shaft and feathers behind. That was the blow he had felt. "Hold him," Woodpecker whispered. Wordlessly, Alligator grabbed Hotfoot from the front, clasping him in an embrace that held him anchored. Hotfoot clenched his teeth and stood still, not resisting, knowing what was coming. He could not afford to make a sound, for that would show unmanly weakness and could attract the Kale. There was a wrench. In a terrible flare of pain, Woodpecker was yanking the arrow out as he had to, but it wasn't coming readily. It tore at the muscle and sinew, the agony of it radiating out through Hotfoot's whole body. He clenched his teeth, making no sound, though all his world was agony. Then the arrow snapped. Woodpecker held the shaft up. It had broken off, leaving the arrowhead embedded. Hotfoot knew that was bad. It meant the malignant Kale spirit of the arrow remained in him, and it would surely cause him much grief. As the surge of pain abated, he felt the wetness on his back and knew it was his blood flowing down. That too was bad, for it was good blood that leaked from this region, not bad blood. Now there was a clamor behind. The Kale were landing. The three ran, Woodpecker leading the way, weaving through the brush. But Hotfoot found that he could not keep the pace. His shoulder was throbbing and his feet were tiring. In a moment, Woodpecker realized what the problem was. The wound was weakening Hotfoot. "Hide," he said. "We will lead them away from you." "They will follow the blood," Alligator pointed out. Woodpecker scooped his hand along Hotfoot's back, soaking it in warm blood. "I will lead them with blood." Then he was away, his hand extended, the blood dripping from it. Hotfoot stumbled to the side, hunched over so that more blood would not drip, and crawled between low palmetto fronds. As he heard the Kale charging, he stretched out under the fronds, face down, his left arm dragging. If the ruse worked, he would be safe. If not, and that, dear friend, completes today's story time. Stay tuned for the rest of this enticing, very interesting story by the great writer, Piers Anthony. Thanks for watching and listening. If you like what I'm doing here, like and subscribe, donate to my Cash App. Catch me in the next video, and may you find lasting happiness. Bye.